You never forget the sound of someone dying, especially not when their last moments are interrupted by a screeching woman in a pantsuit yelling about grass damage while you're literally giving them core. I was kneeling over Mr. Winters, his face purple, his chest still, my hands working fast to push life back into him. I could hear the sirens in the distance. Help was minutes away. But then came the words that froze everything. This is private property. You're trespassing. Cease what you're doing immediately, or we will have you arrested. That's when Doug, the HOA's self-appointed head of security, lunged forward and yanked me backward mid-compression. I lost count of the number of seconds. Mr. Winters went without air. The man flatlined while I was being pinned to the lawn by two goons in matching polo shirts. The worst part, I'm a licensed paramedic, and I was on my day off, just helping someone who collapsed in front of me. This wasn't just ridiculous. It was deadly. It started out like any other Saturday. I was visiting my brother Jason, who lives in the Maple Creek gated community, the kind of HOA-run neighborhood where the mailboxes match the mulch and people measure their hedges with rulers. I wasn't even supposed to be on duty that day. My gear was in my car parked just outside the community pool where Jason and I were grilling up burgers with a few neighbors. We heard a commotion turned and saw Mr. Winters across the street collapsed like someone cut his strings. No hesitation. It grabbed my trauma bag and sprinted. Mr. Winters, probably in his 70s, had slumped to the sidewalk, unmoving. His wife screamed, no pulse, no breath. I started compressions immediately while Jason dialed 911. Adrenaline kicked in, but my training took over. 30 compressions, check airway, 2 breaths, repeat. He had a chance if we acted fast. That's when the shrill voice of doom came echoing across the lawn. Karen, president of the Maple Creek HOA, stormed out of her house like she was auditioning for a villainous Broadway role. Clipboard in hand, heels clicking, she marched toward us, flanked by Doug and another HOA lackey whose name I never bothered to learn. Karen didn't even look at Mr. Winters. Her eyes were locked on me, a stranger in uniform on her lawn. This is a closed community, she snapped. Unauthorized services are not permitted. You need to leave this property. I didn't stop. I didn't even look up. He's in cardiac arrest, I said. I'm a licensed paramedic. He needs CPR now. But she wasn't listening. Doug radioed someone, probably the other guy who guards the HOA clubhouse like it's the Pentagon, and walked over like he was about to break up a bar fight. You need to stop. Now, he growled. You're trespassing and rendering medical aid without HOA clearance. HOA clearance? Like saving lives with some kind of zoning violation. Jason tried reasoning with them. He's helping. The man is dying. But Karen had already dialed a number on her phone. Police, she said smugly. There's an aggressive man on my neighbor's lawn pretending to be a first responder. The next few seconds blurred together. Doug grabbed my shoulder. I resisted, still doing compressions. That's when the second HOA security guy tackled me from the side, slamming me to the grass. My shoulder hit hard. Mr. Winters' wife screamed again, this time louder, more desperate. Jason started filming. You're stopping Cor, he shouted. You're killing him. But they didn't care. To them, HOA rules mattered more than a beating heart. By the time the actual paramedics arrived, Mr. Winters had no pulse. They tried, God, they tried, but it was too late. The moment of survival, the slim chance we had, was gone the minute they pulled me off him. I sat in the back of a patrol car, handcuffed and stunned. I remember the officer saying, "You're under arrest for trespassing and impersonating emergency personnel." My jaw dropped. I didn't even know what to say. I'd shown them my badge, my license, everything. But the HOA had told their version of the story first, and they were the ones wearing car keys and clipboards. They drove me down to the precinct like I was some criminal. I kept trying to explain, but the cops weren't listening. I wasn't allowed to call anyone until they finished processing me. Meanwhile, Jason was blowing up my phone. The video was uploading to Reddit, and Mr. Winters' wife was at the hospital learning her husband died on his front lawn while his would-be rescuer was tackled by an HOA goon squad. Hours passed. They took my statement. A detective finally realized something was off and asked to see my ID again. By then, it was too late. Mr. Winters was gone. Karen and Doug went back to sipping their HOA coffee, and I was sitting in a holding cell wondering how in the hell any of this was legal. They let me go the next morning with a "we'll be in touch," but the damage was done. My face was all over local news by afternoon. Social media was on fire. The video Jason posted had already hit 2 million views. The comments were brutal. People were calling Karen and Dove everything from HOA tyrants to life-blocking lunatics. One user wrote, "They arrested a medic during CPR. That's not HOA behavior. That's criminal negligence." Another posted, "The next time I collapse, please don't let the HOA help." I'd rather take my chances with gravity, but the worst part wasn't the media storm, the hate messages, or the confusion. It was knowing that someone died because of a rule-obsessed group of suburban dictators who thought a heartbeat was less important than neighborhood protocol. That night, as I sat at Jason's kitchen table with a bruised shoulder, a damaged reputation, and a churning gut, I realized this wasn't over. This wasn't going to be swept under a perfectly mowed HOA rug. This was war. The next 48 hours were like watching a dam collapse in slow motion, except instead of water, it was pure public outrage pouring in from every corner of the internet. Jason's video had hit the Reddit front page within 6 hours. By the next morning, every major platform had some variation of the headline. Paramedic arrested while giving CPR by HOA. Man dies. News vans lined the street outside Maple Creek. You couldn't step out without tripping over a reporter or camera crew. It was like our neighborhood had become ground zero for the world's most infuriating injustice, and people weren't about to let it go. Inside the community, everything cracked at once. The neighbors who'd once smugly enforced trash bin placement rules and lawn height regulations were suddenly divided into two camps. On one side were the Karen loyalists, still parroting HOA guidelines like they were scripture. On the other were the angry, red-faced homeowners who realized the people supposedly protecting property values had just cost a man his life. You could feel the tension on every street. People glared at each other at the mailbox. Yard signs started going up overnight. One said, "HOA killed Mr. Winters." Another had a cartoon of Doug in handcuffs with the words, "CPR isn't a crime." Karen tried to save face with a neighborhood-wide email titled "Clarifying the Incident," where she described the event as an unfortunate misunderstanding involving an unverified medical actor. She even referred to Mr. Winters' death as an incidental casualty during a breach of protocol. That sentence alone sparked a storm. Screenshots of the email hit Twitter within minutes. Commenters shredded her. Casualty? Is she talking about a war zone or a barbecue? One post read. Another said, "Unverified medical actor. You arrested a licensed paramedic, not a cosplay imp at Comic-Con." Then came the press conference. Karen, flanked by Doug and two other HOA board members, stood in front of the community clubhouse and read from a prepared statement. Her voice was shaky, but her expression was firm, as if she thought standing tall would somehow make the facts disappear. The HOA acted in accordance with community policies to prevent unauthorized service interactions within Maple Creek, she said. Our intent was never to obstruct care, but to ensure that all aid is properly credentialed and cleared through our security protocols. A reporter shouted, "You mean like CPR?" Another followed up, "Did you know he was a licensed paramedic when you restrained him?" Karen fumbled. Doug stepped forward, wearing a tactical vest with security written in bold across the front. "We believed the individual was performing unauthorized medical procedures that could have put the resident at greater risk," he said. The crowd erupted with boos. That same day, the Winters family released their own statement. Mr. Winters' widow, Grace, stood in front of the hospital where her husband had died, holding a picture of him from their last wedding anniversary. Her voice cracked as she said, "I watched a man try to save my husband's life, and I watched other men pull him away. They didn't ask questions. They just stopped him. And now my husband is gone." That 30-second clip broke people. Millions watched it. People posted reactions, some crying, some shouting, most in utter disbelief. There were fundraisers for the Winters family. Artists painted murals. Memes were made. The story wasn't just viral. It had turned into a movement. At this point, Jason and I couldn't go outside without someone thanking us for sharing the video. Strangers sent messages saying they were donating to emergency responder funds or leaving their HOAs in protest. But Karen and Doug, they weren't backing down. In fact, they started doubling down. Doug posted a now-deleted video of himself in sunglasses and his Fox tactical vest saying, "Maple Creek security will never be intimidated by social media mobs. We will continue to protect our residents with discipline and resolve." The comment section absolutely exploded. Someone tracked down a photo of Doug from 3 years ago dressed as a mall Santa and started circulating it with the caption, "Santa arrests paramedics now." But beneath the chaos, something else was building. Alex, the paramedic, me, wasn't just going to let this slide. I had already met with a civil rights attorney named Victoria Reynolds. She was sharp, relentless, and furious in a way that made you believe justice wasn't just possible. It was inevitable. When she watched the video, she didn't say anything for a full minute. Then she muttered, "They're going to wish they just let you do your job." She promised me that what happened wasn't just wrong. It was unlawful detainment. It was obstruction of emergency medical care. It was civil negligence that resulted in a man's death. Victoria held a press conference the next day. No theatrics, just cold facts. "We're preparing to file a $10 million lawsuit on behalf of my client," she said. "This case involves the unlawful arrest of a licensed paramedic, the obstruction of life-saving medical intervention, and the direct result of that obstruction, the death of a man who could have lived." Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Victoria answered only one. "When do you expect to file?" Someone asked. "Soon," she said, but not quietly. The lawsuit became the nail in the HOA's coffin. The media coverage intensified. State officials started sniffing around. Karen tried to deflect by suggesting the community pass a temporary ban on all unauthorized online filming. That backfired immediately. One resident, a quiet woman named Sophia, went live from the HOA clubhouse holding a spar dummy and said, "This is Bob. Bob's dying. But don't worry. Karen says I need to fill out a form first." Her video went viral in under an hour. Internally, more cracks started forming. Whole board members began resigning. Anonymous tips were sent to local reporters. One HOA treasurer leaked emails that showed Karen had written a message just days before the incident saying, "I'm tired of outsiders thinking they can just waltz into Maple Creek and play hero. Time to make an example out of one." That email hit the news like a bomb. Suddenly, Karen wasn't just the face of a bad decision. She was the villain of a national scandal. Her house was vandalized. Protesters picketed the HOA building. Doug locked himself inside for 2 days, then posted an unhinged rant blaming liberal paramedics and anti-HOA propaganda. Meanwhile, the Winters family lawyered up too, signaling their own incoming legal action. The Maple Creek community, once obsessed with pristine lawns and color-coordinated holiday lights, was in absolute collapse. And somehow, we were only getting started, because Victoria wasn't filing that lawsuit to make a point. She was filing it to make history. When Victoria Reynolds officially filed the lawsuit, the document itself became a headline. Every outlet from Ken to neighborhood Facebook groups was quoting lines from it like it was scripture. "Gross and willful negligence," it read, "malicious obstruction of emergency medical response, reckless endangerment resulting in wrongful death." Those were just the highlights. The full suit stretched over 80 pages and detailed every second of that chaotic afternoon, backed by Jason's footage, audio transcripts from neighbors, and even surveillance video that captured the HOA members dragging me away from Mr. Winters' body like they were wrestling a shoplifter. Victoria wasn't just coming for damages. She was coming for blood. The HOA, in response, did exactly what everyone expected. They lawyered up with a firm more famous for defending country club lawsuits and zoning appeals than high-profile wrongful death cases. Their spokesperson, a stiff man in a navy suit who looked like he'd never made eye contact with a real human being, gave a brief statement to the press. "We categorically deny the allegations. and believed that HOA acted within its rights to manage access and safety in a private community. But no one was buying it. Not anymore, especially not when another bombshell dropped. A local journalist uncovered that this wasn't the first time Maple Creek HOA had interfered with emergency services. 2 years earlier, during a 4th of July party, a resident had broken his leg after falling off a ladder while hanging decorations. The HOA reportedly blocked ambulance access because they hadn't been notified in advance of the emergency vehicle's entry. That incident had been quietly settled with a non-disclosure agreement and a paid-off family. But now that the spotlight was blindingly bright, the truth came spilling out. The OOA had a history. This wasn't a fluke. It was a pattern. Victoria pounced. She added this past incident to the lawsuit, creating a timeline of obstruction and reckless behavior that painted the HOA not just as entitled, but dangerous. Karen's name was on every document. Doug's signature was on the security forms. The board's fingerprints were everywhere. And as that reality sank in, their support in the neighborhood vanished like mist in the sun. Residents started showing up at HOA meetings, not to listen, but to scream. Some held signs that read, HOA equals hazard of authority, while others demanded resignations. The HOA meetings that had once been sleepy gatherings about shrub height turned into shouting matches, live-streamed by teenagers who couldn't believe the circus was real. One resident, a retired judge named Mrs. Finley, stood up at one of the emergency meetings and said, I've spent my entire life interpreting law. What you people did wasn't just immoral. It's prosecutable. That moment made the local evening news. Karen's face, usually a mask of smug superiority, looked like it had cracked into a permanent grimace. Doug stopped showing up altogether. Rumor had it he'd fled to his cousin's farm 3 counties over, claiming he needed time to regroup. No one missed him. Meanwhile, Victoria had gone into overdrive. She held a series of public briefings, each one sharper than the last. She broke down legal precedents, referenced state laws about Good Samaritan protections, and cited medical ethics guidelines that made the HOA's behavior look criminally insane. She even brought in 2 expert witnesses, a former paramedic turned professor and a legal ethicist who specialized in private community overreach. They both torched the HOA in their public statements, calling the situation a modern parable of unchecked power and lethal pettiness. The more the lawsuit gathered steam, the more the media attention exploded. National outlets started running deep dives into HOA horror stories, and Maple Creek became the poster child for everything wrong with these little suburban governments. Late-night talk show hosts roasted Karen by name. One skit featured a fake HOA president banning ambulances because they didn't match the neighborhood's color scheme. Even TikTok got involved, with creators reenacting the incident using car dummies and making hilarious, biting satire. One viral clip showed a guy doing chest compressions while a Karen character screamed, not without a permit, and held a clipboard at his head. It had over 20 million views by the end of the week. Back at the community, the fallout reached nuclear levels. Residents began organizing a petition to dissolve the HOA entirely. Over 70% of the neighborhood signed it within days. That number might have been even higher if not for Karen and her remaining loyalists going door to door, trying to scare people out of signing by claiming their property values would tank without structured governance. But no one was buying it, especially after a new voice joined the fight. Mrs. Winters, Grace, who had stayed mostly quiet since the tragedy, stepped forward with her own lawyer and announced a wrongful death suit independent of mine. Her speech was quiet, emotional, and devastating. My husband died feet from his front door, she said. He died while someone tried to save him and others chose bureaucracy over compassion. This isn't just a lawsuit. This is justice. The crowd at the press event stood silent for nearly a minute afterward. Reporters didn't even ask questions. They didn't have to. Things escalated further when the HOA's insurance company caught wind of the growing legal exposure and swiftly withdrew their liability coverage. Karen was reportedly informed mid-meeting via a phone call, after which she fainted in front of 20 residents and was taken away by an ambulance. Ironically, without any HOA approval. The residents clapped as she was loaded into the vehicle. The irony was so thick even the imps couldn't suppress their smirks. Victoria wasn't done. She filed a motion to freeze the HOA's assets pending litigation. That meant no dues could be spent, no checks signed, no legal defenses funded until the case was resolved. Overnight, the HOA's power became more illusion than reality. They couldn't pay their lawyers, couldn't hire poor, and definitely couldn't contain the tidal wave of anger and ridicule hitting them every second online. People in Maple Creek started to hope again. They hosted CPR training events in protest. One neighbor installed a 6-foot inflatable paramedic in their front yard. Kids started wearing toy stethoscopes and running around pretending to fight the HOA. The neighborhood felt alive again, not because of the conflict, but because people were finally united against something they all realized was a threat to their safety, not a shield for their lifestyle. And while Karen vanished from public view, and Dowd posted cryptic survivalist rants from what appeared to be a shack in the woods, Victoria and I prepared for trial. The evidence was airtight. The witnesses were lined up, and the entire nation was watching, waiting for the day we'd walk into that courtroom and remind the HOA, the public, and every clipboard-wielding tyrant across the country of one simple truth. You don't get to arrest a hero and walk away clean. Not this time. Not ever. The courtroom felt like a powder keg. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Neighbors, reporters, activists, imps from across the state, even law students scribbling notes like they were watching history unfold. The air was thick with tension, and every rustle of paper or shuffle of feet sounded too loud, too sharp. Victoria sat beside me, calm as ever, flipping through her notes with surgical precision. I could feel my heart pounding, not from nerves about testifying, but from anticipation. This wasn't just a trial. It was judgment day for people who thought clipboards and bylaws made them untouchable. The defense looked like they were trying too hard to appear confident. Karen sat stiffly at the defendant's table, flanked by 2 attorneys and dressed like she was running for local office. Pearl necklace, navy suit, forced smile. Dowd was there too, though he looked like he had aged 10 years since the incident. The tactical vest was gone, replaced with a wrinkled button-up shirt that made him look like someone's miserable uncle at Thanksgiving. Neither of them met my eyes. Opening arguments set the tone. Victoria stood and addressed the jury with a voice like steel wrapped in velvet. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her words hit hard and clean. She laid out the timeline. How I began CPR on a dying man. How I was physically dragged away by untrained civilians acting under color of authority. How Mr. Winters lost his life as a direct result. Then she turned toward the defense and said, "This case is not about rules. It's about humanity. It's about the cost of ego and the consequence of entitlement." You could have heard a pin drop when she sat down. The defense tried spinning the narrative, claiming the HOA had a responsibility to regulate services within the community and that the actions taken were in the interest of resident safety. But every time they opened their mouths, they sounded more and more detached from reality. When Karen's attorney suggested that the HOA had no way of knowing I was a real paramedic, Victoria objected and submitted the footage showing me holding up my ED badge and clearly announcing myself as licensed medical personnel. The objection was sustained, and the jury looked visibly annoyed. It was like watching someone argue that rain wasn't wet. When I took the stand, I didn't dramatize. I didn't need to. I walked the jury through every second of that awful day. Mr. Winters collapsing, the car, the screaming, the hands grabbing me, the moment I realized he might die because of them. I kept my voice steady, but there was one point I faltered, when I described Mrs. Winters' face after the paramedics declared him gone. That haunted me. It always would. Grace Winters followed me on the stand, and her testimony shook the room. She recounted watching her husband's body go still as I was ripped away from him. She described how she begged them to stop, how she screamed until her voice broke. She looked right at the jury and said, "He needed seconds. That's all. A few more seconds." And they took that from him. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of someone in the gallery crying quietly. Even the judge had to pause for a moment before proceeding. Then came the expert witnesses. Victoria brought in a trauma surgeon who testified that Mr. Winters would have had a 60 to 70% chance of survival had CPR been continued uninterrupted. The professor of emergency medical ethics confirmed that under both state law and national medical protocols, I was not only allowed but required to continue life-saving efforts, and that impeding me was a direct violation of multiple statutes. Each expert dismantled the defense's arguments with calm authority, and each one left the jury looking more and more like they were ready to throw the book at the HOA. The defense called Karen to the stand, which turned out to be a disaster. Her tone was defensive, her answers robotic. When asked if she regretted stopping me, she said, "I regret that things were misunderstood." That answer was a nail in her own coffin. Then came the kicker. Victoria pulled out the internal HOA email leaked weeks earlier, the one where Karen said she was tired of outsiders thinking they can play hero and wanted to make an example of one. The courtroom erupted. The judge had to call for order twice. Karen's face turned a shade of gray that no makeup could cover. Doug didn't even try to defend himself. He pled the fifth on almost every question. When Victoria showed the video of him tackling me, pausing on the frame where his knee hit my back mid-compression, she didn't say a word. She just let the image speak for itself. The jury stared at it for a long time. No one blinked. Closing arguments were brutal. Victoria looked at the jury and said, "This wasn't an accident. This was arrogance. This was the belief that rules matter more than lives. That appearance matters more than action. That a dying man's final moments were less important than a patch of grass and a power trip." She didn't cry. She didn't shout. But her voice trembled just a little. Just enough. Then she sat down, and I saw half the jury already convinced. When the verdict came in, it wasn't just unanimous. It was explosive. $10 million in damages. Another $5 million in punitive fines. The courtroom burst into gasps. Karen slumped in her seat. Doug stared into nothing. One juror mouthed the word "finally." The judge added that criminal charges for obstruction of medical aid and wrongful death were now being reviewed by the state attorney's office. It wasn't just a win. It was a reckoning. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was electric. Reporters shoved microphones in every direction. Imps clapped. Strangers hugged me. Victoria stood beside me like a general who had just won a war. Mrs. Winters came up, took my hands, and whispered, "Thank you for fighting for him." That broke me. I hugged her back and didn't say anything, because no words felt big enough for that moment. The Maple Creek HOA was effectively dissolved within the week. No board, no dues, no Doug. Karen sold her house for a loss and disappeared. Rumor was she moved to another state under a different name. Doug's property was seized to help cover the judgment. His tactical vest ended up in an online auction titled "Used in History's Dumbest Heiress." Proceeds went to the Winters Foundation for Emergency Training, newly formed by Grace and her kids. The courtroom might have been where the verdict was handed down, but the real justice came later, in the smiles of neighbors who now trained in CPR at block parties, in the children who drew chalk hearts on the sidewalk where Mr. Winters fell, and in every story that reminded the world that no rulebook, no HOA, no clipboard tyrant should ever get in the way of a life being saved. Not ever again. It's strange how fast a place can change once the fear is gone. Maple Creek, once ruled by petty citations and passive-aggressive notices, slipped into mailboxes, transformed into something unrecognizable in the best way. Gone were the uniform hedges and tensed stares. The community had torn down the very structure that once choked the life out of it, literally, in Mr. Winters' case. In its place grew something messier, louder, but infinitely more human. The HOA office was shuttered, the signboard taken down and replaced by a new wooden post hand-painted by the neighborhood kids. It read in red and blue letters, "Community before control." The trial's verdict sent shockwaves beyond our little gated bubble. Media coverage didn't just stop at the courtroom steps. National debates erupted about the unchecked power of HOAs. Politicians weighed in. One congresswoman proposed the Good Samaritan Protection Act that would federally criminalize obstructing emergency aid. Another state lawmaker introduced legislation that would allow residents to more easily disband HOAs. Maple Creek had become the catalyst for a full-blown movement. Our story was cited in op-eds, documentaries, even a late-night monologue that ended with a mock trophy being awarded to me for world's most illegal lifesaver. I didn't care about any of that. What mattered to me was that people were paying attention. And for once, the right people were getting burned. Grace Winters became the soul of the community. Every weekend, she opened her home to host CPR training sessions on her front lawn, using a donated dummy named Walter. Her husband's memory, once stained by trauma, became a symbol of change. Neighbors who never used to say more than a nod at the mailbox now shared meals, stories, and gardening tips. Some even confessed to once supporting Karen and the old regime out of fear or habit. Grace never judged them. She only smiled and said, "We're all neighbors again now." And she meant it. Jason started a podcast called Emergency Exit, focusing on HOA horror stories, power abuse, and community reform. His first episode was, of course, our story, and it topped the charts within a week. Guests poured in, lawyers, paramedics, whistleblowers, and regular folks who'd been steamrolled by rules designed not for safety, but for control. The podcast became a platform for accountability, a voice for the voiceless, and surprisingly, a hub for some much-needed humor. Because as heavy as everything had been, Jason knew how to make people laugh about clipboard crusaders and their bizarre vendettas. As for me, I went back to work as a paramedic, though the department offered me a desk job for a while to ease back into things. I refused. I needed to be back out there. The streets, the sirens, the split-second decisions. That's where I belonged. Still, the calls felt different now. People recognized me. Some shook my hand before I even got them on the stretcher. One guy with a dislocated shoulder refused pain meds just so he could say, "I'm being treated by the guy who went viral for getting arrested while saving a life." That was surreal. But the best moment, the one that made everything worth it, happened a few months later. We got a call about a teenager who'd collapsed during football practice at the local school. Heat stroke. Heart had stopped. By the time we got there, one of the bystanders had already started CPR. I recognized her immediately. It was 11-year-old Lily, one of Grace's granddaughters. She looked up, her hands still in position, her face focused and fierce. We took over and revived the boy within minutes. He lived. The doctors later said Lily's CPR likely bought him the time he needed. When I asked her how she knew what to do, she smiled and said, "Walter taught me. Grandma says everyone should know how to save a heart." That one sentence nearly broke me. Not everything wrapped up neatly, of course. Karen vanished from the public eye, but rumors surfaced that she tried to apply for a job on another HOA board in a neighboring state. That application was leaked and quickly denied after residents sent in links to the court footage and trial transcripts. Dutt wasn't so lucky. He was still tangled up in criminal charges, and the last anyone heard, he was trying to launch a YouTube channel about neighborhood tactical safety. It had 12 subscribers and no comments. With the HOA dissolved, the residents formed a volunteer neighborhood committee, not to enforce rules, but to plan community events, support those in need, and mediate disputes with, shockingly, actual kindness. There were no power trips, no threats about fence paint, just people talking like adults. They didn't have enforcement power, and that was exactly the point. It wasn't about control anymore. It was about connection. The old clubhouse was repurposed into a first aid training center and mini clinic. Victoria helped secure funding through a settlement clause, and volunteers from the local hospital came in on weekends to teach CPR, first aid, and even aid usage. The walls of the clinic bore a mural now. Mr. Winters' face surrounded by symbols of healing, with a quote above it that read, "Don't wait for permission to do the right thing." Victoria, by the way, became a bit of a legend. She declined interviews from most networks but appeared on a national forum about civil liberty law where she calmly tore apart outdated HOA statutes with the kind of grace and fury that made half the panel stare at her in awe. She didn't take a dime from our case. She said it was about principle. She said too many people had been bullied into silence. But she also said something else in private that stuck with me. Sometimes justice doesn't come from the top down. Sometimes it starts on a lawn with a neighbor and a heart that won't quit beating. I think about that every time I drive past the spot where Mr. Winters collapsed. The sidewalk has a small plaque now, not gaudy or flashy, just a simple metal plate with his name and the words a reminder. Help first. Talk later. People stop and read it. Some leave flowers. Others sit beside it for a while. It's not a shrine. It's a seed. The thing about stories like this is that they start small. A man collapses. Someone helps. Someone else gets in the way. Then a camera rolls. A truth spreads. And suddenly, a whole country is looking at itself in the mirror. What happened in Maple Creek wasn't just about one man or one HOA. It was about what we allow when we stop questioning who holds power and why. It was about standing up, speaking out, and when necessary, fighting back with everything we've got. We didn't just win a lawsuit. We reclaimed a community. We exposed a broken system. And most importantly, we made sure the next time someone's life hangs in the balance, there won't be clipboards or tactical vests standing in the way. There will be hands ready to help, hearts ready to listen, and people finally choosing compassion over control.